One phone call, that's all it took to shatter a life. For Clara Rossi, a waitress drowning in debt and despair, that call was a desperate gamble made in a rain-slicked alley, a plea to a number on a blood-stained business card. For Don Vincenzo Moretti, the most feared man in Sovereign City, it was an unwelcome interruption, a crack in the armor of his untouchable empire. She thought she was saving a stranger's life. He thought she was an opportunist or a threat. Neither of them knew they were standing on the precipice of a storm that would drag them into a world of betrayal, obsession, and a love as dangerous as it was inevitable. What happens when a nobody holds the key to a king's only weakness? The answer will cost them everything. The relentless drumming of rain against the grimy window of the Blue Moon Diner was the only soundtrack to Clara Rossi's exhaustion. It was a Tuesday, which meant the city's forgotten souls congregated for the 2-for-1 coffee special, each of them nursing their lukewarm cups and their colder regrets for hours. Clara moved between the cracked vinyl booths like a ghost, her smile practiced and weary, her apron stained with the ghosts of 1,000 spilled coffees and ketchup disasters. Every slosh of the coffee pot, every clatter of cheap cutlery, was a tick of the clock counting down the seconds to foreclosure, to the day the hospital would stop her sister Sophia's treatments. Sovereign City was a place of brutal contrasts. From the diner's window, Clara could see the glittering spires of the financial district, piercing the storm clouds, monuments of glass and steel where men traded fortunes without ever touching a dollar. Down here, in the city's gut, people traded what was left of their dignity for another day's survival. Clara existed in that gut, her dreams long since digested by reality. At 11:30, the last of the stragglers had been shooed out into the wet, unforgiving night. Wiping down the sticky counter, her reflection in the streaked chrome of the napkin dispenser looked back at her, a stranger with dark circles under her eyes. She was 24, but tonight she felt 100. The day's meager tips, a crumpled collection of 1s and 5s, wouldn't even cover the overdue electric bill. A familiar knot of panic tightened in her chest. "All right, Sal, I'm heading out," she called to the cook, a mountain of a man who communicated primarily through grunts and the sizzle of his grill. He grunted in reply, not looking up from his newspaper. Stepping outside, Clara pulled her thin coat tighter. The alley behind the diner was a shortcut to the bus stop, a dark chasm between brick walls that always smelled of stale grease and damp concrete. Tonight, the rain had washed the air clean, but the shadows seemed deeper, more menacing. Halfway down the alley, her foot hit something soft. Not a discarded trash bag, but something that yielded with a low groan. Her heart leapt into her throat. She fumbled for her phone, the cracked screen casting a weak, flickering light. On the wet pavement lay a man. He was young, probably her age, dressed in clothes that screamed money even when soaked and stained. A tailored wool coat, designer jeans, and a watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her sister's life-saving medicine. A dark, ugly gash ran across his temple, and a crimson stain was spreading slowly from his side, mingling with the rainwater. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Panic seized her. Call 911. That was the first rule. But in this part of town, an ambulance often brought the police, and the police asked questions. Questions about a body in the alley behind your work. Questions that could get you fired, or worse, noticed. And for people like Clara, being noticed was always dangerous. Her trembling light fell on his face. He was handsome in a reckless, arrogant way, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like one of the men from the glass towers, fallen from his throne. As she knelt, her hand brushed against his coat pocket. a hard rectangle, a wallet. Her hands shook, but a desperate, reckless impulse took over. She needed to know who he was. Inside the fine leather wallet, there was no cash, just a series of platinum credit cards and a driver's license. Lorenzo Moretti. The name meant nothing to her, but behind the license was a single, stark, white business card, thick as cardboard. The engraving was simple, severe, and utterly terrifying. Vincenzo Moretti. There was no title, no company name, just the name and a phone number. Clara's blood ran cold. She didn't read the society pages or watch the news, but there were names in Sovereign City that you just knew. Names that were whispered in fear and reverence. Moretti was one of them. Vincenzo Moretti, the Lion of Sovereign City, the man who owned politicians, judges, and half the skyline she could see from the diner. A man whose business was death and power. This unconscious boy on the pavement was his son. Her mind reeled. The police were a bad idea, but calling this number felt like suicide. They would think she did this. They would think she was a witness, a loose end to be tied up. She should run. Walk away, get on the bus, and pretend she never saw a thing. Let the city swallow him up like it swallowed everyone else. But then, she looked at his face, at the pallor beneath his skin, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was just a boy, someone's son. And Sophia. If it were Sophia lying here, Clara would pray for a stranger to have the courage she was currently lacking. That thought, the image of her sister's fragile smile, was the only thing that could have made her do it. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, shakily dialed the number. It rang once, a stark, electronic sound in the oppressive silence of the alley. A voice answered, low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that held no warmth, no welcome, only absolute and unnerving authority. Yes? Clara's own voice was a reedy whisper. Hello? I'm looking for Vincenzo Moretti. There was a pause, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. You found him, the voice rumbled. Who is this? She swallowed, the rain dripping from her hair onto the phone screen. My name is Clara Rossi. You don't know me. But I think I've found your son. He's hurt. He's lying unconscious on the street. Another silence, this one sharper, more dangerous. The lion was listening. Where? The single word was not a question. It was a command. Clara gave him the address, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the words. The alley behind the Blue Moon Diner. Don't move, the voice ordered. Don't talk to anyone. Don't touch him again. We are 5 minutes away. The line went dead. Clara stared at her phone, the finality of the click echoing in the alley. 5 minutes. She had just 5 minutes until the most dangerous man in the city arrived. She looked down at the bleeding boy at her feet, then up at the dark, indifferent sky. Her life, the fragile, precarious thing she had guarded so carefully, had just ended. She had no idea that a new one, terrifying and brilliant, was about to begin. The 5 minutes stretched into an eternity. For Clara, they were a frantic, heart-pounding lifetime spent kneeling in the rain. The weak light of her phone, her only companion. Every distant siren, every rumble of a passing truck sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She was a witness, a loose end. The stories about Vincenzo Moretti were not fairy tales. They were cautionary ones, whispered by people who knew better than to say his name too loudly. He didn't just solve problems, he erased them. She half expected a fleet of black cars to descend on the alley, men in suits pouring out like soldiers. The reality was far more unsettling. Exactly 4.5 minutes after the call ended, a single vehicle, a black Bentley Mulsanne, turned silently into the mouth of the alley. Its headlights cut through the gloom, pinning Clara in their brilliant, unforgiving glare. The car was utterly silent, its engine a low purr that was more felt than heard. It moved with the predatory grace of a shark. The Bentley stopped a few feet away. The driver's side door opened and a man emerged. He was enormous, a wall of tailored black wool, his face a mask of grim professionalism. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes scanned the alley, the rooftops, the dark doorways, his hand resting inside his jacket. Then the rear passenger door opened. Vincenzo Moretti stepped out of the car and into the rain. The storm didn't seem to touch him. He wore no coat, just an impeccably tailored Brioni suit the color of midnight, which should have been instantly ruined by the downpour, but somehow wasn't. He was older than Clara had imagined, perhaps in his late 40s, with threads of silver at his temples that only served to accentuate the predatory darkness of his hair. His face was all harsh angles and controlled intensity, a face that belonged on a Roman coin. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of emotion. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had mastered it. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. He didn't rush to his son. Instead, his gaze fell first on Clara, who was still kneeling on the wet asphalt, frozen in the headlight's beam. He assessed her in a single, sweeping glance. Her cheap, soaked coat, her worn-out sneakers, the fear in her wide eyes. It was a look that stripped her bare, weighed her, and found her wanting. "You're the girl?" he asked. His voice was the same one from the phone, a low rumble that vibrated in the air. Clara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. Another man, younger and leaner than the driver, had emerged from the passenger seat. He carried a black leather bag and immediately knelt beside Lorenzo, his movements quick and practiced. A doctor. Vincenzo finally walked over to his son, his expensive leather shoes stepping through the grime of the alley without a hint of hesitation. He looked down at Lorenzo, and for a fleeting, imperceptible moment, something flickered in his cold eyes. It wasn't just concern, it was a deep, primal anger. The lion, seeing his cub wounded. The mask of control snapped back into place almost instantly. "He's stable," the doctor said quietly. "Blunt force trauma to the head, and what looks like a knife wound to the abdomen. It's not deep, but he's lost a lot of blood. We need to move him now." Vincenzo gave a curt nod. The massive driver, who Clara now understood was a bodyguard, effortlessly lifted Lorenzo and carried him to the car as if he weighed nothing. The doctor followed, shutting the door behind them. And then, Clara was alone in the alley with Vincenzo Moretti. The rain continued to fall, plastering her thin brown hair to her scalp. He stood before her, an imposing silhouette against the blinding headlights. "You found his wallet," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she managed, her voice a croak. "His ID was inside. And your card. You took nothing." Again a statement. His eyes bored into hers, searching for any flicker of deceit. "No, of course not. I wanted to help him." Vincenzo took a step closer. The air crackled with a dangerous energy. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and something else, something metallic and cold like power itself. "Help him," he repeated, the words laced with a deep, chilling cynicism. People in this part of the city don't help a Moretti. They run, or they look for an angle. An opportunity. "So I will ask you again, Miss Rossi. What do you want?" The accusation in his voice was a slap. He saw her not as a good Samaritan, but as a scavenger. The injustice of it, on top of the fear and the cold, sparked a tiny ember of defiance inside her. "I don't want anything," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I saw a man bleeding in an alley. I did what any decent person would do." A corner of his mouth twitched, a motion that was not a smile. It was something far more menacing. "Decency," he mused, as if it were a foreign word. "A luxury few can afford. You work in that diner. You live 3 blocks away, in the tenements on Ash Street. Your sister, Sophia, has stage 4 leukemia. The experimental treatment she needs costs $200,000 a year. You, Miss Rossi, cannot afford decency." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. He knew. In the handful of minutes since her call, he had unearthed the entire pathetic story of her life. The knowledge was a violation, a display of power so absolute it left her breathless. He hadn't just learned her name, he had unraveled her soul and found all her desperate, secret pains. "So," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than a shout, "let us dispense with the pretense. You found my son. You made a very intelligent call. You have my attention. Now, tell me what you saw. And then, tell me your price." He looked at her, expecting her to crumble, to name a figure, to finally reveal the greed he was so certain was lurking behind her frightened eyes. He saw her as a piece on a chessboard, a pawn to be moved or sacrificed. He had no idea that this pawn had a will of her own, and she was about to make a move he could never have anticipated. Clara stared at Vincenzo Moretti, the facts of her life laid bare between them like an autopsy report. He expected her to beg, to barter, to sell her story for a chance at her sister's life. The part of her that was drowning in medical debt screamed to do just that. Name a price. $200,000, a number that was both a fortune and a pittance to the man standing before her. It was the smart play, the one anyone in her position would make. But as she looked into his cold, calculating eyes, the defiance she'd felt earlier hardened into resolve. He had stripped her of her privacy, her dignity. He had assumed the worst of her. If she took his money, she would be confirming his cynical view of the world and of her. She would be just another transaction in his ledger. And something inside her, something she thought had died long ago, rebelled. "I saw a man who needed help," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I have no price." Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture. He had been leaning forward slightly, the predator about to close a deal. Now he stood straighter, a flicker of genuine surprise in his dark eyes. He was a man who believed everything, and everyone had a price. Her denial was not just a negotiating tactic, it was a disruption of his entire worldview. "No price?" he repeated slowly. "Miss Rossi, do not mistake me for a fool. Your sister is dying. You are one paycheck away from eviction. Do not insult my intelligence with false piety." "I'm not," she insisted, shaking her head. The rain felt cold on her hot cheeks. "Taking money for doing the right thing makes it the wrong thing. I won't sell my conscience, not even for my sister." The words felt hollow as she said them. What was a clear conscience to a dying child? But they were the only weapon she had. For a long moment, Vincenzo simply studied her. The noise of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the rain and their breathing. He was reevaluating her, reassessing his initial judgment. This was not going according to his script. "Marco," he said, without turning his head. The lean, handsome man who had been standing silently by the car stepped forward. This was Marco Vescovi, Vincenzo's most trusted advisor, a man whose ambition was cleverly hidden behind a veneer of loyalty. "Don Moretti," Marco said, his voice smooth as silk. "Escort Miss Rossi home," Vincenzo commanded, "and stay with her." Clara recoiled. "Stay with me? Why? I'm not—" "You are a witness," Vincenzo cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Until I know who did this to my son, you are the only link I have to them. That makes you a target, or it makes you a suspect. In either case, you will not be left alone. You are now under my protection. It is not a request." He turned and walked back to the Bentley, his movements fluid and final. He didn't look back. The car door closed with a solid, expensive thud, and the vehicle glided out of the alley, disappearing into the night as silently as it had arrived. Clara was left with Marco Vescovi. He had a charming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Rossi, if you'll follow me. We have another car waiting." She had no choice. She was swept into a world she didn't understand, her protests dying in her throat. 20 minutes later, she wasn't at her shabby apartment on Ash Street. She was standing in the marble-floored lobby of the Sovereign, the most exclusive residential tower in the city, a building owned by Vincenzo Moretti. Marco led her to the penthouse elevator. "A precaution," he explained smoothly. "Your apartment is not secure. Don Moretti has arranged for you to stay here for a few days." The apartment, it was an insult to call it that, was a sprawling palace in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the entire city, the glittering lights stretching out like a fallen constellation. The furniture was minimalist and brutally expensive. The art on the walls was original, and the silence was absolute. It was a cage made of glass and gold. A woman in a neat grey uniform appeared. "Miss Rossi, my name is Helena. I am the housekeeper. If you require anything, please let me know. There are clothes in the closet for you." Clara was too stunned to speak. She walked into the bedroom. The closet was larger than her entire apartment. It was filled with designer clothes, all in her size. On the bed, laid out neatly, was a set of silk pajamas. This wasn't just protection, it was a statement. It was a way for Vincenzo to control her, to indebt her. The next morning, Marco appeared at her door. "Don Moretti would like to see you," he said. He led her not to an office, but to a private medical wing within the building. In a pristine white room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital room, Lorenzo Moretti was awake. He was pale, with a bandage on his head and an IV in his arm, but his dark eyes were alert and sharp. Vincenzo stood by the window, looking out over his city. "Miss Rossi," Vincenzo said, turning to face her. "My son is alive, thanks to you." Clara looked at Lorenzo, who gave her a weak, slightly lopsided grin. "So you're the angel of the alley," he said, his voice hoarse. "My father said you wouldn't take any money. I didn't believe him." "I'm glad you're okay," Clara said, feeling awkward and out of place. Vincenzo stepped forward. He held a sleek, black checkbook. "I do not like being indebted to people, Miss Rossi. You saved the only thing in this world that matters to me. You refused payment, and while I find that unusual, I will respect it. However, you did not refuse help." He wrote something on the check, his movements precise. He tore it from the book and held it out to her. It was not made out to her. It was made out to the Sovereign City Cancer Institute. The amount was $250,000. "This is not a payment," Vincenzo said, his voice low and intense. "This is a donation to the hospital, earmarked for the experimental treatment program. Your sister's place in the trial is secured. It is done. There are no strings attached. You are free to go." Clara stared at the check, at the elegant, looping signature. Her vision blurred with tears. Everything she had fought for, prayed for, was right there in her hand. Sophia would live. It was a miracle. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at him. His dark eyes met hers. "Because you did not ask," he said simply, "and because I need to know that I can trust you. The people who attacked my son are still out there. They may know you were a witness. You are still in danger." "So I'm not free to go," she realized. "No," Vincenzo confirmed. "This check buys your sister's life. Your continued cooperation buys yours. You will remain here, in this building, where I can watch you, and you will tell me again every single detail you remember from that alley." The check in her hand felt impossibly heavy. It was a gift, a miracle, a blessing, but it was also a chain. He had found her price after all. It wasn't money, it was her sister's life. And for that, Clara Rossi would do anything. She was no longer just a witness. She was a possession of Don Vincenzo Moretti. The days that followed blurred into a strange, disorienting routine. Clara lived in the penthouse, a prisoner in unimaginable luxury. Helena, the silent housekeeper, attended to her every need, serving gourmet meals Clara couldn't bring herself to eat, and laying out expensive clothes that felt like a costume. She spent hours staring out at the city from behind the bulletproof glass, a sprawling, vibrant world that she was no longer a part of. She was an observer, a ghost haunting a palace. Twice a day, Marco Vescovi would escort her down to the medical wing to see Lorenzo. The younger Moretti was recovering quickly, his youthful constitution warring against his injuries. He was charming and flirtatious, treating his near-death experience as a grand adventure and Clara as its beautiful heroine. "You know," he said one afternoon, propped up against a mountain of pillows, "when I'm out of here, I'm taking you to dinner. Not some greasy spoon like that diner either. I'm talking about Le Ciel. You have to book a table 6 months in advance." "I'm not really the Le Ciel type," Clara answered quietly, her gaze drifting to the door, always expecting Vincenzo to appear. "We can change that," Lorenzo said with a wink. "A dress from Valentino, some diamonds. My father can afford it." He saw her as a project, a beautiful stray to be cleaned up and paraded. He was kind in his own way, but his worldview was as narrow and privileged as his father's was cynical and dark. He didn't understand that the clothes and the diamonds were not a gift, but the bars of her cage. Vincenzo was a far more sporadic and unsettling presence. He would appear without warning, sometimes in the medical wing, sometimes in her penthouse, always moving with that unnerving silence. He never engaged in small talk. His questions were always about the attack, dissecting her memory of that night in the alley. "The car," he asked one evening, standing by the vast window as the sun set, painting the city in hues of orange and blood. "You heard no car before you found him?" "No, it was quiet. Just the rain. No voices. No sounds of a struggle. Nothing." He would stare at her, his dark eyes seeming to search for the lie he was convinced she was telling. He was a master of control, and Clara was a variable he couldn't solve. Her refusal of his money, her quiet defiance, her complete lack of guile. It all fascinated and infuriated him in equal measure. He was a man used to breaking people, but he couldn't find a single crack in her. One night, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the penthouse was louder than the sirens of Ash Street. She wandered into the vast living area and found him there, standing on the balcony, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was looking down at the kingdom he had built. She hesitated, about to retreat back to her room, but he spoke without turning. "You should not be afraid of heights in a place like this." She slowly walked over and stood a few feet away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. The night air was cool. "I'm not afraid of the height," she said softly. "I'm afraid of the fall." He finally turned to look at her. In the dim light of the city below, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He looked tired. "Everyone falls, Miss Rossi. The question is whether you have the strength to get back up." "Is that what you did?" The question was out before she could stop it. It was too personal, too bold. A long silence hung between them. She expected a sharp rebuke, a dismissal. Instead, he took a slow sip of his Macallan 25. "I did not have the luxury of falling," he said, his voice a low murmur. "When you are a lion, you are either on the throne or you are a rug. There is nothing in between." It was the first time he had spoken to her as a person, not a witness or a problem. She saw a flicker of the man behind the myth, a man burdened by the crown he wore. "Lorenzo is lucky to have you," she found herself saying. Vincenzo's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and intense. "Luck had nothing to do with it. You made a choice." "Why?" he asked, the question that had been haunting him. "Why him? A stranger in an alley. Why risk calling me?" Clara thought of Sophia, of the fierce, desperate love she felt for her sister. "Because," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "no matter who he is or who you are, he is still someone's son. And a world where people let a child die alone in the rain is not a world I want to live in." His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze shifted. He looked at her, not as a pawn or a puzzle, but as something else entirely. Something rare. He had surrounded himself with soldiers and sycophants, men who followed him out of fear or greed. This quiet, stubborn waitress possessed a form of strength he hadn't encountered before. Integrity. From his position in the medical wing, Lorenzo watched the growing connection between his father and Clara with a mixture of confusion and resentment. He saw the way his father looked at her, the way he lingered after his interrogations. The Don, who had never shown a moment of softness to anyone, was being disarmed by a waitress. Lorenzo had brought her into their world, and now he felt like he was being pushed out of it. His gratitude for being saved began to curdle into jealousy. The gilded cage had 3 occupants now, and the tensions within its walls were becoming as dangerous as the threat lurking outside. A week after the attack, Sovereign City began to feel the pressure. Vincenzo Moretti was on the hunt, and when the lion was hungry, the entire ecosystem felt it. Shipments went missing from the docks controlled by the rival Falcone family. Key Falcone businesses were suddenly buried in regulatory inspections, and several of their top enforcers were arrested on long-forgotten warrants. Vincenzo was applying his power like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, deep, and designed to cause maximum pain with minimal noise. The consensus, carefully curated by whispers in the right ears, was clear. The Falcones had finally crossed the line. Attacking the Don's only son was a declaration of war. Marco Vescovi was the most vocal proponent of this theory. "It was Antonio Falcone," Marco insisted, during a meeting in Vincenzo's stark, modern office. "It has his signature all over it, a sloppy public attack meant to provoke. He's trying to show us he isn't afraid. We need to retaliate, a show of force. We hit him back, hard and fast, before he thinks he has the advantage." Vincenzo sat behind his massive obsidian desk, steepling his fingers. He listened, his face an unreadable mask, but his mind was elsewhere. The Falcone theory made sense. It was the obvious answer, and Vincenzo Moretti had built his empire by never trusting the obvious answer. "Antonio Falcone is a peacock," Vincenzo said, his voice a low growl. "He is vain and stupid, but he is not suicidal. He knows what would happen if he touched Lorenzo. This was too reckless for him. It feels personal. What could be more personal than a family rivalry? Marco pressed, a hint of frustration in his smooth voice. Vincenzo's gaze drifted towards the security monitors on his wall. One of them showed a live feed of the penthouse garden, a lush green space on the roof of the skyscraper. Clara was there, sitting on a stone bench, reading a book. Even in the grainy black and white image, her quiet stillness was captivating. She was the one inconsistency in the entire equation, the one pure element in a world of deceit. His visits to her had changed. They were less like interrogations and more like conversations. He found himself asking about her life, her sister, the books she read. He learned that she loved classic literature, that she had dreamed of being a teacher before her sister got sick, that she possessed a simple, unshakable moral compass that he found both naive and fascinating. She was like a visitor from another world, and he, the king of his dark domain, was inexplicably drawn to her light. One evening, he found her in the penthouse library, a room she had gravitated to naturally. She was running her hand over the leather-bound spine of a book. "Do you read Dante?" he asked from the doorway. She jumped slightly, not having heard him approach. "A little. In college, before I had to drop out. I always loved the idea of the journey, of walking through hell to find paradise." "There is no paradise, Miss Rossi," he said, stepping into the room. "There is only one hell, and then another, slightly less painful hell." "I don't believe that," she said softly, turning to face him. "There has to be something good, something worth fighting for." He walked closer to her, the space between them shrinking until it was charged with an unspoken energy. He could smell the clean, simple scent of her shampoo, a stark contrast to the heavy perfumes of the women who usually occupied his world. "And what do you fight for?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "For hope," she answered, her gaze unwavering. "For the belief that even in the dark, there's a reason to look for the light." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. It was an impulsive, uncharacteristic gesture, one that surprised them both. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The Don and the waitress, the lion and the lamb. Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his for something she couldn't name. It was a moment of profound, terrifying connection, a crack in the foundations of both their worlds. The moment was shattered by the buzz of his phone. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his mask of control slamming back into place. It was Marco. "We have a problem," Marco's voice said, tight with urgency. "One of the men we picked up, a Falcone soldier. He's talking. He says the hit on Lorenzo wasn't from Antonio. He says the order came from inside." Vincenzo went still. "Inside?" "That's what he's screaming. He said the man who paid him wasn't a Falcone. He described him. Tall, lean, always wears a silver ring on his right pinky finger." Vincenzo looked down at his own hand, then his mind flashed to an image of Marco, gesturing emphatically during their meeting that morning. On his right pinky finger, a silver ring, a family heirloom he never took off. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Marco, fueling the war with the Falcones to create chaos. Marco, using the attack on Lorenzo to position himself. Marco, the man he had trusted like a brother, was the serpent in his garden. And Clara, she wasn't just a witness to the Falcones. She was a witness to Marco's betrayal. Her danger had just increased 100-fold. He had brought her into his world to protect her, but he had only placed her in the very center of the storm. The revelation hit Vincenzo like a physical blow. Marco, his protégé, his right hand, the man he was grooming to one day take his place. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it momentarily stole his breath. He had built his world on a foundation of loyalty, enforced by fear. To be undone from within by the one man he thought was unshakable was the ultimate failure. He ended the call, his mind a maelstrom of cold, calculating fury. He needed to be certain. A cornered rat's confession was not enough. He needed irrefutable proof before he moved against a man as entrenched in his organization as Marco. His first instinct was to hide Clara, to send her away where Marco couldn't reach her. But he knew it was too late. Marco was cunning. If he sensed the slightest change in routine, if Clara suddenly vanished, he would know the game was up and accelerate his plans. No, Vincenzo had to play this hand with surgical precision. He had to keep everything exactly as it was. Clara, however, was becoming a complication he couldn't control. Her own intuition, honed by a life of watching people's subtle cues for survival, was telling her something was wrong. She saw the new tension in Vincenzo, the way he watched Marco with a chilling stillness. She also noticed things on her own. During one of her escorted walks in the rooftop garden, Marco's phone rang. He stepped away to take the call, but his voice carried on the wind. She heard only snippets. The girl is a problem. Getting too close. Needs to be handled soon. He thought she was a problem for Vincenzo, a distraction. But Clara's blood ran cold. He hadn't said the Don. He'd said getting too close. Close to what? She tried to rationalize it, to tell herself she was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched, of a specific and personal threat, intensified. Meanwhile, Lorenzo was growing more suspicious by the day. Confined to his bed, he had nothing to do but observe. He noticed the way Marco's reports about the Falcones never quite added up, the way he would steer conversations away from certain topics. Lorenzo had grown up in a world of lies. He had a finely tuned ear for them. He and Marco had never been close. Lorenzo's recklessness had always been an irritant to Marco's meticulous ambition. One afternoon, Lorenzo called Clara to his room. "My father trusts you," he said, getting straight to the point. "I don't know why, but he does. He listens to you." "I don't think he listens to anyone," Clara replied honestly. "He watches you," Lorenzo corrected. "It's the same thing. I need you to do something for me. Marco keeps his personal laptop in his study down the hall. My father gave him a suite here in the building. I need to get inside it. He won't suspect you." "Why?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. "What are you looking for?" "I don't know yet," Lorenzo admitted. "But my father taught me one thing. When a story is too perfect, it's always a lie. And the story Marco is telling about the Falcones is perfect." An unlikely alliance was formed, born of shared suspicion. Clara, terrified but resolute, agreed. That evening, feigning a headache, she asked Helena for a specific herbal tea she knew was kept in the main kitchen, which was located on the same floor as Marco's study. While Helena was gone, Clara slipped away. Her hands trembled as she used a keycard Lorenzo had given her, a MasterCard he had borrowed from a guard, to open the door to Marco's suite. The study was immaculate, cold, and impersonal, just like its owner. The laptop was on the desk. She didn't have the password, but Lorenzo had told her what to look for. A USB port in the back. She inserted a small flash drive he had given her, which he claimed contained a program that could copy recent files in seconds. As the files copied, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic seized her. She pulled the drive, slid it into her pocket, and flattened herself behind a heavy curtain just as the door opened. It was Marco. He walked in, but he wasn't alone. With him was a man Clara recognized with a jolt of pure terror. He was one of the men from the diner on the night of the attack, a customer who had been staring at her just before she'd gone out to the alley. He hadn't been a customer. He had been a lookout. "Is it done?" the man asked. "Almost," Marco replied, his voice a venomous hiss. "The Don is ready to move on the Falcones. Once the war starts, there will be chaos. In the middle of it all, a tragic accident. The lion dies, and a new one takes the throne. But the girl is a problem. She saw you that night, didn't she?" "She saw nothing. It was dark," the man grunted. "She doesn't need to have seen anything," Marco snapped. "She exists. She's a loose thread. And after I take care of Vincenzo, she will be my first loose end to tie off. Permanently." Clara held her breath, her body rigid with fear. They left the room, and she waited a full minute before daring to move. She stumbled back to her room, the flash drive clutched in her hand like a talisman. She didn't go to Lorenzo. She went straight to Vincenzo. She found him in his office, staring at a map of the city. Without a word, she walked to his desk and put the flash drive down. "Lorenzo was right," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "It was Marco. I heard him. He's planning to kill you." Vincenzo looked from the drive to her face, his expression grim. He had come to the same conclusion through his own channels, but her confirmation, the raw terror and courage in her eyes, was the final piece of the puzzle. He had put her in the path of a monster, and she had walked through fire and brought him the proof. He picked up the drive. "Marco has made 2 mistakes," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "He underestimated my son, and he underestimated you." He stood up and walked around the desk to stand in front of her. "He will not make a third." The air in Vincenzo's office became deathly still. The game was over. All that remained was the final, brutal move. Vincenzo inserted the flash drive into his computer. The files that Clara had copied were encrypted, but it took his technicians less than 10 minutes to break them. On the screen were bank records, offshore accounts, a series of multi-million-dollar transfers from an unknown source, with the final, largest payment scheduled for the day after the planned hit on the Falcones. There were also encrypted emails, communications not with the Falcones, but with a Russian syndicate looking to gain a foothold in Sovereign City. Marco wasn't just staging a coup, he was selling the entire Moretti Empire to the highest bidder. Lorenzo, the heir, was meant to be the first casualty. Vincenzo, the king, was to be the last. Vincenzo's face was carved from granite. The betrayal was deeper and more absolute than he could have ever imagined. He looked at Clara, who stood pale and trembling but refused to look away. She had not only saved his son, she had now saved his kingdom. "He will know I was in his room," she whispered. "He'll come for me." "Yes," Vincenzo said, his voice a low, chilling promise. "He will. And we will be ready for him." His plan was simple, elegant, and deadly. He would let Marco think his scheme was proceeding perfectly. He publicly announced a full-scale war council for the next evening, a meeting of all his capos to plan the strike against the Falcones. It was the event Marco was waiting for. The moment Vincenzo and all his loyal men would be gathered in one place, a perfect target. Marco would use the chaos of the meeting to eliminate Vincenzo. But Marco's primary leverage, the one thing he believed he could use if things went wrong, was Clara. Vincenzo met with Lorenzo, explaining the final moves of the game. "He will take the girl," Vincenzo stated. "He believes she is my weakness. He will use her as a shield." "You can't let him get to her," Lorenzo insisted, his face tight with anger. "I am not letting him," Vincenzo corrected. "I am counting on it." The next evening, the trap was set. Vincenzo left for the war council, a staged meeting at a secure warehouse across town. He left Clara in the penthouse, seemingly with a reduced security detail, a deliberate vulnerability. As Vincenzo's car pulled away from the building, Marco made his move. He used his override codes to disable the cameras on the penthouse floor and dismissed the guards with a story about a new protocol from the Don. Clara was waiting in the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was the bait. The door slid open, and Marco stepped inside, a silenced pistol in his hand. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, predatory triumph. "What a shame," he said, his eyes roaming the room. "All this luxury, and you won't get to enjoy it for much longer." "Where is he?" "He's gone," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "To the War Council. He's going to destroy the Falcones." "Oh, I doubt that," Marco sneered. "There are other plans for tonight. You and I are going to take a little trip. Insurance." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. He dragged her towards a private service elevator, the one he planned to use to exit the building unseen. But as the elevator doors opened, he stopped. It was not empty. Vincenzo Moretti stood inside, flanked by two of his most loyal and most lethal enforcers. He was not at the warehouse. He had never left the building. Marco's face went white with shock. In a split second, he reacted, yanking Clara in front of him, pressing the cold muzzle of the pistol to her temple. "Don Moretti," he hissed. "An unexpected pleasure. Stand down, or the girl dies." Vincenzo's face was utterly devoid of emotion. He took a slow, deliberate step out of the elevator. "You are mistaken, Marco," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You think she is my weakness, my shield. You are wrong." He kept walking forward. One step. Two. "I mean it, Vincenzo," Marco screamed, his composure cracking. "I'll kill her." "She is not the shield," Vincenzo continued, his dark eyes locked on Marco's, ignoring the gun, ignoring Clara completely. "She is the bait, and you are the rat who walked right into the trap." In that instant, Marco understood. He had been played from the very beginning. Clara was not a shield. She was a tool, a means to an end. In his rage and panic, his grip on Clara loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Clara needed. Acting on pure instinct and the adrenaline of terror, she stomped her heel down hard on his instep and drove her elbow back into his ribs. Marco grunted in pain, his hold faltering. She threw herself to the side, scrambling away on the marble floor. The sound that followed was not a loud bang, but a soft, wet thump, and then another. Marco's eyes went wide, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. Two small, dark red circles appeared on the front of his pristine white shirt. He looked down at his chest, then back up at Vincenzo. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He crumpled to the floor. Silence descended on the penthouse. Clara was on the floor, breathing in ragged gasps, staring at Marco's body. Vincenzo walked over, his own pistol, fitted with a suppressor, still in his hand. He looked down at his former protégé for a long, cold moment. Then his gaze moved to Clara. He knelt down in front of her, his movements surprisingly gentle. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His eyes, for the first time, were not cold or calculating. They were filled with a raw, complex emotion she couldn't decipher. "It is over," he said softly. She looked from Marco's lifeless form to the powerful, dangerous man kneeling before her. The man who had used her, protected her, and ultimately saved her. She was alive. She was safe. But her old life was gone forever. She was now part of his world, a world of violence and shadows, bound to him by secrets and blood. She had walked through hell, just as she'd read in her books. She looked into Vincenzo Moretti's eyes and wondered, with a terrifying thrill, if this was what it felt like to find paradise. And so, the waitress who made a single phone call found herself standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay the simple, difficult life she had always known. Before her stood a man who was both her protector and her captor, offering her a world of immense power and terrible danger. Clara Rossi survived the fall, but now she must choose her future. Can she truly live in the lion's den, forever bound to the darkness that saved her sister's life? Can a love born from violence ever find peace? The story of the Don and the waitress is far from over. Their most dangerous battle, the one for their own hearts, has just begun. Thank you so much for listening. If you were captivated by Clara and Vincenzo's story, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with a friend who loves drama, and subscribing to the channel for the next chapter in their thrilling saga. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single twist.